The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart ER hum at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency Hannah Clarke stopped noticing 6 years ago. She moves through the night shift at 0247, her scrubs copper-stained at the left hip where she'd set down a cup during the dinner rush that never came. The ER is the particular empty of hospitals at this hour, not quiet, but waiting. Monitors beeping in steady rhythm. The ice machine in the break room chunking out cubes. A distant code page from the third floor that doesn't concern her, followed by the soft pad of shoes on polished tile. Hannah's hands tremble slightly as she wipes down the crash cart, the metal cool beneath her palms. Not from fatigue. From the same reason her hands have trembled for 20 years during the first hour of each shift. The adrenaline never fully leaves. It just learns to wait. She steadies her grip on the defibrillator pads, checking the expiration date with the kind of muscle memory that belonged to a different lifetime. The pads are good through next March. Everything in this room is prepared for crisis. Everything except the nurse holding the supplies. The tremor stops when she moves to the medication cart. Her right shoulder catches slightly, a hitch that most people never notice because she compensates for it so smoothly it might as well be invisible. The bullet wound healed. The scar tissue stayed. Some things don't come out clean, even after 2 decades. She's dressed like every other night shift nurse at Sacred Heart. Long sleeves despite the July heat outside, a choice she frames as sun sensitivity if anyone asks. The sleeves cover the faded scar tissue that crawls up her left forearm like ivy. They also cover the place where a shrapnel fragment missed her radial artery by 8 mm in Tikrit. The ER doesn't need to know that Hannah Clarke once held a 34-year-old sergeant's hand while his legs were being amputated without anesthesia. It just needs her to count pills accurately and know where to find the 4 catheters in the dark. She's good at invisible. She's exceptional at invisible. The overhead lights cast everyone in the same grey pallor. Hannah moves through the ER like water finding the path of least resistance. Efficient. Present. Somehow absent. The other nurses know her as steady, quiet, competent enough but never flashy. Nobody asks her personal questions. Nobody invites her to after-shift drinks. She's the nurse who takes every holiday rotation, never calls in sick, works twice as hard as anyone else, and somehow never gets promoted past staff position. That's how she prefers it. Visibility is a liability. At 0301, the radio crackles from the ambulance dock. Dispatch voice, calm and professional, running through vitals like a grocery list. 26-year-old male, IED blast trauma, auditory nerve damage, unresponsive, ETA 4 minutes. Kandahar. The word hits her before she knows why. The dispatcher says it plainly, location of incident, just information, but Hannah's entire body goes rigid for exactly 2 seconds. She continues organizing the medication cart. Nobody sees the pause. Nobody sees the intake of breath she had to take twice to get it right. The ambulance arrives with that particular squealing of brakes that means they pushed hard on the way in. Red lights through the ER windows, then the garage doors opening, then the thunder of wheels on the concrete ambulance bay floor. The paramedics come through with practiced urgency. 26, deaf from blast trauma, unresponsive, 2 liters normal saline wide open, pressure dressing on left arm. The words wash over the ER staff like they always do. Hannah watches from the medication station, her expression neutral, her hand steady now. Whatever tremor existed has been locked away. She catches the patient's face for only a moment as they wheel past. Young. Determined even in unconsciousness. There's something in his jawline, the set of his mouth, that makes her chest tighten. The same look she's seen before, but she doesn't reach for that memory. She spent 2 decades teaching herself not to reach for memories. Dr. Marcus Caldwell emerges from his office with the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from a trust fund and a family name that opens doors. He's 48, his suit tailored well enough to suggest money, his cologne expensive in the way that announces itself. He takes the trauma handoff with the lazy authority of someone who's never doubted his place in the hierarchy. Hannah returns to the crash cart, begins restocking supplies. The work is familiar enough that her hands perform it without conscious direction. "We'll need a bay setup," Caldwell is saying to the resident, his voice carrying the particular disdain of a surgeon who'd rather be anywhere else at 3 in the morning. "Get a full neuro workup. Deaf from blast trauma, probably catastrophic inner ear damage. Make sure he's signed all appropriate paperwork. We don't need complications down the line." Hannah checks the oxygen tank pressure without appearing to listen. 78% full. She makes a note on the supply log. The patient gets wheeled into Trauma Bay 2, which means she'll be responsible for restocking that room once they're stabilized. The protocol is predictable. The work is always the same. But she can't stop herself from moving toward Trauma Bay 2. Not close enough to intrude. Just close enough to see. The patient is still wearing his jacket. Military issue, sand-colored, the kind that gets folded wrong when you're unconscious and bleeding. One of the paramedics is beginning to cut it away, standard trauma protocol, get everything off to expose the body. Hannah's breath catches. She moves forward without deciding to move forward. "I'll take his personal effects," she says. Her voice comes out even. Just a nurse doing her job. The paramedic doesn't look up. "Yeah, sure. Bag it up." She takes the jacket before it gets shredded. It's heavier than it should be, the fabric still holding the shape of a body, still holding warmth. Hannah moves to the supply room, the one with the shelves of bandages and compressed gauze, and closes the door behind her. She sets the jacket on the shelf. Her hands move without permission. The lining is faded from years of wear, the stitching loose in places. She finds it almost immediately because she's looking for it without knowing she was looking for it. The patch, sewn carefully into the interior lining where it won't be visible. A faded insignia. The unit designation embroidered in thread so worn it's barely distinguishable. Special Forces. The same insignia she wore for 17 years. The same insignia she removed with a seam ripper in a hospital bathroom in Bethesda while a doctor told her the nerve damage to her shoulder would probably be permanent. Hannah's hand trembles. One hand trembles. The other stays perfectly still, holding the jacket like it might fracture if she grips too hard. 20 years. 20 years of scrubs and night shifts and invisible hands and the careful erasure of every trace of Major Clarke. 20 years of rebuilding herself from nothing, of learning to walk without flinching at sudden sounds, of managing the phantom pain in her left shoulder that the doctors said wasn't real but the mirror told her was absolute. 20 years of moving through life like she was made of water, like she was supposed to pass through rooms without changing anything about them. And then a patient rolls in with a faded patch and a determined jawline and the address of her own ghost written into his face. The door opens behind her. Dr. Caldwell steps into the supply room with the kind of casual authority that suggests he doesn't consider this space as belonging to anyone else. His eyes move from her face to the jacket she's holding. She doesn't have time to hide it. She doesn't have time to compose an explanation. She's caught holding a folded jacket in both hands like it's made of glass, like it's made of something that requires careful handling. "You seemed quite emotional during that admission," Caldwell says. His voice is smooth, carefully concerned, the voice of someone performing professional worry. "I noticed you examining his jacket rather thoroughly. Perhaps you need some time off to collect yourself." He smiles. The smile doesn't reach his eyes. We can't have nurses making decisions based on personal attachment. It clouds judgment. Hannah looks up from the jacket. Her face is steady. Her voice is steady. Everything about her is steady except for the one hand that trembles, and she hides that hand behind the fabric. "I was securing his personal effects," she says. "Of course." Caldwell steps closer, and his eyes track the way her fingers tighten on the jacket lining. He sees the patch. His expression shifts almost imperceptibly, a recalibration of his face that suggests he's processing information that wasn't in the briefing. "I'm simply suggesting that some distance might be healthy. Especially given how you reacted when he came through the doors." Hannah says nothing. The supply room suddenly feels very small, the fluorescent light from above casting Caldwell's face in sharp shadow. She can read him the way she learned to read people in Tikrit, the micro-expressions, the hand positioning, the way his weight shifts forward slightly when he's about to assert power over someone. He's testing her. He's watching to see what she does with the jacket, with the patch, with the knowledge that he knows she's looking at something that means something. "I understand, Doctor," Hannah says quietly. She folds the jacket with careful precision and sets it on the shelf beside the bandage rolls. Her hands are steady now. The tremor has retreated to the deepest part of her chest where it can't be seen. "I'll maintain appropriate professional boundaries." Caldwell nods, satisfied. He reaches past her to grab a box of surgical gloves from the upper shelf, and in that moment, that fraction of a second when his attention shifts, Hannah's eyes meet the patch one more time. Faded embroidery. A unit designation that exists on no official roster anymore. A reminder that some things survive longer than they should. "See that you do," Caldwell says, and leaves the supply room. Hannah stands alone among the fluorescent lights and the neatly organized shelves of medical supplies. Her hand is trembling again now. Both hands are trembling. She closes her eyes and forces herself to take a measured breath, the kind she learned in a military medical school that no longer lists her in its alumni records. The kind that comes from having already survived the worst. The overhead page crackles at 0520, cutting through the steady beep of monitors like a blade. "Han neither hopeful to administration." "Han neither hopeful, your optimism is needed in administration." The words hang in the ER like poison gas. Laughter ripples across the nurse's station, not loud, but enough. A resident exchanges a glance with his colleague. A nursing assistant turns away, shoulders tight. Hannah stands at the chart station reviewing Chen's vitals, her hand steady on the clipboard, her eyes never leaving the numbers. Oxygen saturation trending up. Blood pressure stabilizing. Everything her hands knew how to fix. She takes one measured breath, the kind learned in a military medical school that no longer lists her in its alumni records, and she doesn't look up. Doesn't acknowledge the page. Doesn't give them the satisfaction. She walks to administration on the 4th floor at 0535, her steps even and deliberate on the tile. The corridor smells like old coffee and floor wax. Her badge swings against her ribs, a metronome counting down something she doesn't yet understand. The administrative office is glass-walled and aggressively beige. Dr. Caldwell sits behind a desk that costs more than her annual rent. Margaret Chen, the nursing supervisor, sits to his right with a folder open. Not Chen the patient. A different Chen. The universe has a cruel sense of timing. "Hannah, thank you for coming up," Caldwell begins, his voice the texture of a surgeon's precision, every word measured and placed like a suture. "We need to discuss your patient interaction this morning." Sergeant Chen's admission. He folds his hands. "You seemed quite emotional during that assessment. I noticed you examining his personal effects rather thoroughly. His jacket, specifically. His belongings, not his wounds." He pauses, letting the accusation breathe. "Perhaps you need some time to collect yourself. First responder fatigue is real. I wouldn't want to see you make clinical errors." Margaret nods, pen poised above the folder like a weapon. Hannah's jaw tightens once, then releases. "I was cataloging belongings per protocol, Dr. Caldwell. Standard admission procedures. We document what patients arrive with." Her voice is flat. Professional. The voice of someone who has already learned that emotion is ammunition in the wrong hands. "You were crying in the supply closet at 0410, Caldwell says, and his smile doesn't reach his eyes. It's the smile of a man watching a chess piece move exactly where he wants it. Night shift intensity can affect judgment. Can cloud our perspective. I'm concerned about your fitness for acute care environments. Your emotional volatility. Your boundary issues with patients." He leans forward slightly. "We might consider reassigning you somewhere less demanding." One tear escapes Hannah's left eye. Not from fear. Not from shame. from the effort of holding everything else back. She wipes it without breaking eye contact, and she watches Caldwell's expression shift, just fractionally, as if he's encountered something unexpected. Something that doesn't fit his calculations. "You're documenting observations very carefully, Dr. Caldwell," she says quietly. "About me. About my work. About which patients I care for." Margaret shifts in her chair. The pen stops moving. "Just good management," Caldwell replies, but his voice has changed key. Less certain. "Patient safety is always the priority." Hannah leaves the office at 0608. She doesn't remember walking out. She remembers the smell of antiseptic and the feeling of being catalogued like a specimen under glass. By 1100, she's back on the floor, hunting supplies in the medication closet. The fluorescent lights hum their endless song. She reaches for foot tubing and Caldwell steps in behind her, closing the door so quietly it's almost gentle. The closet is 3 feet wide. He stands too close, a violation of space that's calculated and cruel. "I've already called your supervisor about performance concerns," he says, his voice dropping to match the intimacy of the space. "Specifically your emotional volatility. Your boundary issues. Your inability to maintain professional distance." He blocks the door with his body. "Maybe it's time you found work somewhere less demanding. Urgent care, perhaps. School nursing. Somewhere you won't be triggered by military patients." The word triggered hangs in the air like a slur. Hannah counts 3 heartbeats. Steadies her breathing the way she learned when mortars were falling 200 meters away. "You want me away from that patient specifically," she says. Not a question. Caldwell's smile widens. "I want what's best for everyone's career trajectory. For the hospital. For Chen. And frankly, for you." He steps slightly closer. "We both know you're in over your head with acute care. It happens. Not everyone can handle this environment." His presence makes the air pressure change. She notices this the way soldiers notice details, the weight of his breathing, the micro-tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintains so she can't prove he touched her. "Did I stutter?" Hannah says, and her voice has dropped an octave. Different now. The voice underneath the nurse voice. The voice that comes from somewhere deeper. Caldwell blinks. Withdraws slightly. The mask of professional concern slips for just a moment, and she sees something underneath, not a man concerned about patient safety. A man afraid of being seen. She doesn't wait for his response. She turns sideways and slides past him, moving with the precise economy of someone trained to navigate tight spaces under fire. The door swings open. The hallway air is cool and smells like hope, which is to say, it smells like nothing. At shift change, 1,700 hours, Caldwell intercepts her in the parking lot. She's walking to her car, a 2009 Honda Civic that's paid for and runs like it hates her, when he catches up, his white coat fluttering like a flag. The arriving crew is visible 30 feet away. 4 nurses. 2 techs. An attending cardiologist. Close enough to watch. Far enough to plausibly deny they heard. "Hannah, effective immediately, you're being reassigned," he announces, his voice pitched perfectly for an audience that isn't officially listening. "We're moving you to night rotation in the subacute wing. We need more experienced hands with stable post-operative patients. Critical care clearly isn't your strength right now. You seem overwhelmed." He says it like he's doing her a favor. Like he's concerned. Like this is care. A nurse named Sandra, who worked the same ER shifts as Hannah for 3 years, whispers to another nurse. Someone's phone comes out. Someone's recording. The moment crystallizes into something permanent. Hannah stands perfectly still. Her hospital badge swings against her ribs on its lanyard, a slow, measured pendulum counting down the seconds. The parking lot is hot and smells like diesel exhaust and the ozone smell of afternoon thunderstorms building on the horizon. Her car is parked in the same spot it's been parked for 6 years. She looks at Dr. Caldwell. Studies his face the way she learned to study faces in Tikrit, reading the micro-expressions that come before the violence, the small tells that separate truth from deception. And then she speaks, and her voice is so quiet that only Caldwell hears it. The arriving crew catches the shape of her mouth moving, but not the words. "You're afraid I'll remember where I saw you before." The color drains from Caldwell's face. His mouth opens. Closes. His hand reaches for her arm and stops mid-motion, as if even touching her might trigger something in the surveillance system, might create evidence that can't be explained away to the board of directors. "I don't know what you're talking about," he says, but his hands are trembling. That's when she knows she's right. Hannah takes one measured breath. Just one. And she lets a single tear escape, not from pain, not from defeat, but from the precise moment when she understands that Caldwell isn't afraid of her competence as a nurse. He's afraid of her competence as a witness. He's afraid of what she saw in Tikrit, in that field hospital where he was discharged for theft. Where he walked past wounded soldiers with a clipboard and a calculation in his eyes. Where he examined their injuries not as a doctor but as a potential profit margin. She wipes the tear without breaking eye contact. Doesn't turn away. Doesn't flinch. Stands there in the afternoon heat of a Norfolk parking lot in front of 4 witnesses while a man with institutional power realizes that the nurse he just humiliated might be the only person on earth who can place him at a crime scene he's spent 18 years trying to forget. The arriving crew doesn't know what they're watching. But they feel it anyway. The moment when the power in the exchange flips. When the hierarchy inverts. That night, Hannah shows up for her new assignment in the subacute wing, a floor of post-surgical recoveries and long-term ventilator patients, far from Chen's ICU room. The day nurse who gives report won't meet her eyes. Just hands over the chart and leaves without the usual pleasantries. 12 patients. All stable. None of them deaf. None of them carrying faded unit patches or memories of Tikrit. Hannah takes report and doesn't argue. Argues. She's learned that arguing is how they document your decline. At 2100, she's checking a wound vac on a post-op knee replacement when her phone buzzes. Text message from Torres, the hospital IT specialist, Marine veteran with a lightning bolt tattooed on his wrist, the kind of guy who has panic attacks during 4th of July fireworks displays and remembers who sat with him in the break room when they happened. Chen's vitals crashing. Day shift missed something. Caldwell pulled you off his case at 1400. Chen needs you. Hannah stares at the message for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moves toward the stairwell, and the charge nurse on subacute catches her arm. "You're not assigned to ICU anymore," she says. Not unkindly. But final. Hannah looks at her face, studies it the way she's been trained to study faces. "Did Dr. Caldwell specifically tell you to keep me away from him?" The charge nurse's silence is confirmation. Hannah uses the back stairs anyway. Muscle memory from combat operations finds routes that most people miss, the service stairwell that runs behind the main corridors, the path that avoids the main elevators, the way through the pharmacy corridor that connects to the ICU hallway. She reaches the ICU at 2127 to find Caldwell standing outside Chen's room, talking to a cardiologist who looks exhausted and out of options. "He's been unstable all day," Caldwell is saying, his voice adopting the careful neutrality of someone who has already decided he doesn't care what happens to this patient. "We're managing conservatively given his multiple traumas and the complexity of his presentation. Some patients require time to stabilize. We're monitoring closely." Through the window, Hannah sees Chen's neck veins distended, bulging against his skin like something trying to escape. His trachea is deviated slightly to the left. His oxygen saturation drops from 88 to 84 to 79. A classic tension pneumothorax. Pressure building in the pleural space, collapsing his lung, pushing his heart sideways in his chest. The kind of thing the day shift probably attributed to anxiety. To pain from the amputation. To the normal chaos of a trauma admission. But it's not normal. It's a death sentence if nobody intervenes in the next 4 minutes. Caldwell sees Hannah standing at the end of the hallway and his expression hardens into something sharp and dangerous. "You need to leave this floor immediately," he says, his voice carrying across the ICU like a command. "You are not assigned here. I'm calling security if you don't move right now." Hannah looks at Chen. Then at the monitor showing his oxygen saturation at 74. Then at Caldwell. "He has a tension pneumothorax," she says, each word deliberate as a bullet. "Deviated trachea. Distended neck veins. Hypoxia cascading. He needs immediate needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. He's got maybe 3 minutes before his heart stops." Caldwell's voice drops to a lethal whisper. "He's been thoroughly examined by qualified physicians. Your judgment is exactly why you were reassigned. Your emotional response to this patient is affecting your clinical assessment. Security is 2 minutes away. Leave now, or I will have you escorted from this building." Hannah watches Chen's lips turn blue. She takes one measured breath. And then, the reassignment to subacute felt like exile. Hannah pushed the ventilator cart down the corridor at 1900 hours, the hallway lights casting everything in that particular shade of hospital fluorescent that made skin look like old newspaper. Post-surgical recoveries. Long-term vents. Patients who were stable, predictable, 3 floors away from the ICU where David Chen lay in a bed Caldwell had strategically cleared her from. The bastard was thorough. She'd give him that much. Her scrubs were still damp from the sink where she'd splashed her face after the supply closet. Not from crying, from rage. There was a difference, and Hannah had learned years ago how to channel one into the shape of the other. She moved between rooms with mechanical precision, checking tube placement on Mrs. Kowalski's vent, adjusting the bear hugger on a post-op from thoracic surgery, documenting vitals on patients whose names she'd forget by midnight. The work was competent. Empty. At 21:31, her pager vibrated. Not the hospital system. The old Motorola clipped to her waistband, the one Torres, the IT Marine, had quietly told her to keep. One message. One number. Chen's room. Her fingers went still on the keyboard. 02 Sat 71. Falling. The rest of it lived in the space between heartbeats, Caldwell at the ICU desk, probably, checking his watch. Secure in the knowledge that Hannah Clarke, just a nurse, just a trauma survivor who couldn't handle her emotions, was 3 floors below, reassigned, neutralized, watching other people's patients breathe. The misdiagnosis was already a ghost in the system. Day shift had charted normal lung sounds. Normal chest rise. Normal sat on room air at admission. They'd missed the pressure building inside Chen's chest cavity because nobody was looking for it. The machinery of a hospital grinding forward, competent but not exceptional. Competent enough to kill. Hannah set down her pen. Moved into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer as she walked toward the stairwell. Not the elevator. Never the elevator when you needed speed. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs like a countdown. 2 flights. Her hands were steady. Her breathing pattern hadn't shifted. The trembling Caldwell wanted to see wasn't coming because it had no permission to arrive. Pain was data. Fear was intelligence. Everything else was noise. She was halfway to the 3rd floor when the overhead intercom exploded into life. Code blue, ICU, code blue ICU. The words came in that particular cadence that meant actively dying, not just crashing. The alarms were already screaming when she hit the ICU threshold. The unit looked like controlled chaos had become something else entirely. Organized, almost. A resident in oversized gloves was fumbling with a chest tube kit at Chen's bedside. The charge nurse was doing compressions. An RN Hannah recognized from night shift was pushing epi. And Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the bed with his hands positioned like he was about to conduct a symphony that nobody wanted to hear. Hannah stopped at the doorway. 50 feet away. Close enough to see Chen's face go the color of ash. His back arched like something was breaking inside him, which it was. The needle decompression hadn't been done yet. Caldwell was setting up for a tube insertion when what Chen needed was a blade into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where the tension was bleeding his lungs flat. 40 seconds of chest compressions. The numbers began their climb, epinephrine at 2 minutes, repeat dose at 4, the clock inside her head older than her body, tuned to the frequency of men dying on tables in places where the sand never stopped blowing. O2 sat 98, someone called out. Not true. The monitor showed 68, and the ventilator was struggling against lungs that had no room to expand. 1 minute. Chen's heart rate on the monitor was an electrical ghost, the impulses firing but nothing pumping blood. P. Pulseless electrical activity. The kind of arrest that only meant one thing: something mechanical was stopping his heart from working, and unless they fixed the mechanics in the next 90 seconds, electrical activity would stop mattering. Caldwell was still angling wrong. The tube position he was preparing wouldn't drain the pressure, it would just perforate the visceral pleura and make things worse. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd read the textbook but had never felt a chest collapse under his palms. Hannah had felt 3. 2 in Kandahar. 1 in a FOB hospital outside Tikrit where a kid who'd walked into a daisy chain IED was losing his lungs to the same thing Chen's lungs were losing right now. Caldwell glanced back toward the doorway. Saw her standing there. His eyes held something that might have been satisfaction. "I said you need to leave," he called, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who'd spent his entire career learning how to make other people's mistakes. "Security will escort you." Hannah didn't move. Her right eye, the one that twitched sometimes when she'd been pushing 18-hour shifts for too long, stayed perfectly still. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, the motion deliberate, controlled. 1 tear had escaped. Just 1. She let it fall and didn't acknowledge it again. Then she moved. Not toward the elevator. Not toward security. Not toward the doorway that would take her out of the ICU. She moved toward Chen's bed with a kind of fluid momentum that made the resident step back instinctively. Her hand was already in the crash cart before anyone registered the movement. 14-gauge needle. Size for pediatric endotracheal tube that she'd pulled last year during a code downstairs and never returned because someone who'd walked through the dust of Tikrit learned to keep tools close. The charge nurse looked up. Recognized something in Hannah's face that made her step aside instead of stepping in. "What are you doing?" Caldwell's voice had changed texture. Still commanding, but the overtones had shifted. Fear lived underneath now, trying to stay hidden. Hannah didn't answer. She positioned the needle between Chen's ribs where they counted, second space, mid-clavicular, and felt the resistance give way with a hiss. Air. Pressurized air screaming out through the needle like he'd been holding his breath since the IED in Kandahar and was only now allowed to exhale. The monitor changed immediately. The numbers that had been flatline and falling began to climb, blood pressure rising, oxygen saturation shifting from 68 toward 72, the mechanical pressure inside his chest finally having somewhere to go. "Get me a chest tube kit," Hannah said. Not a request. Not a question. The voice that came out was a different frequency entirely, calm, certain, carrying the weight of decisions made when there was nobody else left to make them. 1.5% lidocaine. Scalpel. The resident moved. The charge nurse moved. The attending who'd been in another code on the 4th floor, whose absence from this room might have killed Chen in the next 30 seconds, was suddenly standing beside her, no longer making decisions, just assisting. Caldwell stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his hand still positioned in the shape of the procedure he'd been about to botch. The fluorescent lights above Chen's bed hummed their electric pressure. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, finally able to push air into lungs that had room for it now. O2 sat climbed, 74. 80. 84. Who authorized this? Caldwell's voice cracked like old leather. Hannah didn't look at him. She was watching Chen's chest rise, watching the monitor stabilize into something that resembled a rhythm, watching the color drain from ash-gray into something closer to human. Her hand moved through the next steps with the kind of muscle memory that lived in fiber and reflex, the scalpel making the incision, the chest tube sliding into place, the stopcock turned to let the remaining pressure drain into the underwater seal. "I did," she said quietly. Not to Caldwell. To no one in particular. Just a statement of fact, offered to the room like a prayer answered by silence. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. The clock on the ICU wall read 21:36 when Hannah crossed to Chen's bedside, her movements economical and direct. Caldwell materialized in the doorway like a shadow with a pulse, his voice dropping to something surgical and sharp. "Do not touch this patient. You are not assigned here and your license is under review." Hannah's eyes didn't leave the monitor. 90 seconds of PEA. Pulseless electrical activity. The rhythm was there on the screen, organized, almost mocking, but Chen's heart wasn't contracting. Every second the oxygen debt accumulated. Brain cells were dying. "Move," Hannah said. Her voice was level, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Or watch him die." Caldwell didn't move. He was waiting for her to break protocol, to give him the public insubordination he needed to justify what he'd already set in motion. His face carried the faint satisfaction of a man holding a loaded weapon. Hannah sidestepped him without permission, which in the mathematics of hospitals meant she'd chosen her patient over her license. She grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart, not the chest tube kit with its careful layers of sterility, but a number 10 blade from the surgical tray, the kind meant for opening skin. She'd used one before. Not recently. Not since Tikrit. Blood welled across Chen's chest the moment the blade bit between his 4th and 5th ribs. The incision was for inches, deliberate, her hands moving like they belonged to someone else entirely. The ICU resident gasped. A nurse reached for the call button. Caldwell's voice rose somewhere in the distance, calling for security, but Hannah had already stopped hearing him. She spread the ribs open with her fingers, no retractor, no hesitation, no time for the proper equipment. The anatomy was there under her hands, muscle and bone and the desperate architecture of a body failing. Her left hand found his heart directly. She could feel it quivering against her palm like a bird with a broken wing, trying to pump against pressure that shouldn't exist. Her right hand found the source, tension pneumothorax on the left side, the pressure collapsing his vena cava, strangling the veins that fed the heart itself. "Adjust ventilator pressure," Hannah said to no one in particular, because the only person who would move was the one who'd been trained to listen. A respiratory tech stepped forward. Caldwell shouted something else, his voice tight with something between fear and fury. Security was 2 minutes out. Hannah had seconds. She couldn't place a chest tube from this angle, so she did what 17 years of muscle memory demanded. She used her hand to manually expand the compressed lung tissue, holding the collapsed segment open while her eyes stayed on the monitor. 30 seconds. The heart flutter strengthened under her palm. 60 seconds. A pulse registered on the screen. 90 seconds. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed like a prayer being answered, 74, 79, 85, 91. Hannah didn't let go until the attending arrived, a second-year resident named Dr. Patel who moved like someone stepping into a dream they didn't quite understand. She walked him through the proper chest tube placement to avoid the vascular structures she could feel under her fingertips, her voice mechanical and precise, offering guidance from a body that had stopped being a civilian nurse 3 minutes ago. When she finally withdrew her hand at 21:41, her forearm was covered in blood that wasn't hers, and the room was silent except for the steady beep of Chen's monitor, sinus rhythm, regular and strong. Caldwell stood in the doorway, his face the color of old plaster. But that wasn't the worst part. By 0600, when the sun hadn't quite broken through the Norfolk rain, Hannah's security badge wouldn't open any of the doors. Not the time clock, not the staff bathroom, not the locker room where Margaret stood with an expression of profound apology and looked away when Hannah arrived. Her locker had been emptied. Not cleaned. Emptied. Everything she'd accumulated in 20 years of nursing, the photographs, the books, the small tokens of a life rebuilt in careful increments, was stacked into a cardboard box that was already developing a soft spot along the bottom from accumulated moisture. A cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading blue letters. A succulent plant she'd been forgetting to water for 6 months, leaves papery and brittle. A photograph from 2004 of 9 soldiers in desert fatigues, standing in front of a sand-colored building with Tikrit written on the back in marker. 3 faces had been crossed out with black ink. Hannah didn't know why she kept it. Muscle memory, maybe. Evidence that those people had existed. HR handed her the termination paperwork at 0847. Erratic behavior. Procedural violations. Performing surgery without authorization. Patient boundary violations. The language was precise and bloodless, the kind of institutional grammar that turned a life-saving procedure into a disciplinary offense. Dr. Caldwell has already contacted the State Nursing Board, the HR representative said. Her name was Sandra, and she'd laughed at Hannah's jokes during orientation 3 years ago. There will be a hearing, likely within 60 days. Hannah took the paperwork. Did he explain that Chen was in cardiac arrest? Sandra's silence was answer enough. Torres appeared as Hannah left the building, materializing from the stairwell like he'd been waiting. The IT tech wore his uniform with the bearing of someone who'd learned to carry rank quietly. He pulled her aside, away from the security camera's sight lines, his voice dropping to something between urgent and careful. Caldwell's been accessing veteran patient records after hours for 6 months, Torres said. Copying disability ratings. Medical histories. Psychiatric assessments. I think he's selling them. Hannah looked at him for 3 seconds. Long enough to understand. Long enough to know that Torres had already started building the case. Long enough to understand that the man who'd just destroyed her career was scrambling to destroy the evidence of something much larger. Thank you, Hannah said. For what it's worth, Torres said, what you did for Chen. That wasn't erratic. That was the most controlled thing I've ever seen. Hannah walked out of Sacred Heart into a Norfolk morning that was threatening rain. The cardboard box was heavy, the bottom giving way incrementally. By the time she reached the bus stop 3 blocks away, dirt from the succulent had spilled across the photograph, and water was beginning to soak through the cardboard itself. She stood at the corner of Monticello and 17, holding a box that contained everything she'd kept from her old life, waiting for a bus to somewhere. The rain came harder. Headlights blurred into streaks of color passing through wet darkness. Her clothes were still stained with blood, Chen's blood, probably, though after a while it all looked the same. Then she heard them. The rotor wash started as a distant percussion, then grew into something that made the utility poles vibrate. 2 Black Hawks, their sound signatures distinctive even in the rain, Sikorsky UH-60M variants, the kind of helicopter that made your spine straighten whether you'd heard them before or not. They appeared over Sacred Heart's roofline, spotlight beams cutting through the rain like something biblical, and they didn't land on the helipad. They landed in the front parking lot. Hannah watched from the bus stop as the side doors opened and a Navy SEAL team exited, 8 operators in full tactical gear, their movements flowing like water, the kind of precision that comes from having already survived places most people will never see. They moved into Sacred Heart's main entrance with purpose. Her bus arrived. The driver looked at her, at the disintegrating cardboard box, at the water pooling on the concrete beneath her feet. Hannah didn't move. She was watching the helicopters. Torres called 5 minutes later. His voice was something between panic and urgency. You need to get back here, he said. Now. Hannah walked back through rain that was turning the world liquid, back toward the hospital, back toward the fluorescent lights and the machines that beat the rhythm of human survival. Her scrubs were drying stiff with blood. Her license was under review. The State Nursing Board was being called. None of it seemed to matter against the sound of those rotor blades still turning in the Sacred Heart parking lot. The ER was chaos when she entered through the main doors. The SEAL team commander stood in the center of the nurses' station, his presence making the air pressure change like he'd just occupied space that the room didn't know how to hold. A scar traced his jawline like a story that had already been told. Master Chief insignia. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "We're looking for Major Clarke," he said. "Callsign Sandstorm." Staff stared. The arrival of 8 tactical operators in a hospital ER at 2,105 hours was not something that fit into protocol. Caldwell stepped forward from where he'd been lurking near the supply closet, his hands raised in a gesture of placation. "There's no one here by that," he started. Chen appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by a night nurse named Rodriguez who moved with something between awe and understanding. The young sergeant was awake and alert, his eyes clear and focused, and he was signing frantically, his hands moving in ASL with the urgency of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Torres stood beside him, translating from American Sign Language into English, his voice steady and clear. "Major. She saved my life. Major Clarke saved my life in Tikrit when I was 6 years old." The room went silent in the way that happens when the fabric of understood reality splits open. A young resident named Emily picked up Hannah's personnel file, the sealed military section that HR had never opened, that had been sitting in the system for 20 years waiting for a reason to be read aloud, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "Hannah Marie Clarke. Service number for 28-71-9043. Bronze Star with Valor device. Purple Heart. 17 combat deployments with Special Forces Medical Detachment." Caldwell's voice rose again. "This is clearly a mistake." The SEAL commander's gaze shifted toward him with the weight of judgment. His voice cut through everything else like it was a scalpel blade. "Major Clarke is the most decorated combat medic in Special Forces history. 2 silver stars for actions in Tikrit, including saving 43 civilians during a hospital siege under fire while taking shrapnel to her shoulder and back." Hannah entered through the ER entrance, soaking wet, still holding her cardboard box. The crowd of nurses and residents and security officers parted without being asked. The photograph inside the box, the one with the crossed-out faces, pressed against her hip. A Navy captain stepped forward, her insignia marking her as Pentagon liaison, her bearing carrying the weight of institutional authority. Her voice was crisp and official and somehow kind. "Major Clarke, we're reactivating you for a classified training mission at Fort Bragg. We've been searching for you for 3 months, you didn't update your contact information after your medical discharge." The captain's gaze shifted to Caldwell, and her expression changed. Not anger. Something colder. Official. "We're also investigating how sealed Special Forces medical records appeared on insurance broker networks. Your name appeared on access log 17 times in the past 6 months. Torres stepped forward with a tablet, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been building a case in careful silence. Every second of security footage from the past 6 months. Backed up to 3 separate drives. Caldwell's face drained of color. The room held him, and he understood suddenly that he was no longer the one holding power. That everything he'd built in careful institutional language had crumbled the moment Hannah had put her hand inside another human being's chest and refused to let him die. Security. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause. Hannah stood 3 blocks from Sacred Heart at exactly 2,100 hours, holding a cardboard box that contained the only evidence of her civilian life. The cracked mug reading "World's Okayest Nurse" felt heavier than it should have. Inside the box, a dying succulent with browning leaves, and beneath it, a photograph, her platoon, 23 faces, 2 of them no longer breathing. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. The termination papers were already in her personnel file. Erratic behavior. Procedural violations. Dr. Caldwell had moved with surgical precision, expediting her through HR while her security badge lay deactivated on a desk somewhere, inert as a bullet removed from its chamber. She'd pushed a stretcher for 18 years, healed the broken, held the dying. In 6 hours, she'd become unemployable. The bus shelter leaked. Water dripped from the corroded metal frame in a rhythm that matched her breathing, deliberate, measured, mechanical. She watched headlights blur through rain-soaked streets and thought about the young intern who'd found her in the supply closet just before her walkout. Nervous kid named Marcus, barely 23, still soft with the shock of learning how hospitals really functioned. "Dr. Caldwell has a side business," Marcus had whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I saw it when I was pulling files for his office. He's got a whole network, selling veterans' medical records to insurance adjusters. Disability ratings, service-connected injuries, everything. He's been doing it for 6 months, maybe longer." Hannah had held her composure. Didn't ask questions. Didn't react. But the math had assembled itself behind her eyes with the precision of a rifle being loaded. Caldwell at Tikrit. Caldwell discharged from the field hospital 6 years ago for stealing medication from supply convoys. Caldwell seeing her this morning, seeing the faded unit patch she'd examined in Chen's jacket lining, and understanding immediately what it meant. She was the only witness who could place him there. The bus turned a corner 3 blocks away, its headlights sweeping across wet asphalt. Hannah checked her phone. 20:53 hours. 7 minutes until she left Norfolk behind. 7 minutes until Caldwell disappeared into the review mirror of her own erasure. Then the sky opened up differently. Not rain. Rotor wash. The sound came first, that distinctive heavy thud of helicopter rotors cutting through humid air, the kind of sound that made your chest cavity vibrate. Hannah looked up from the cardboard box, and her eyes tracked the military signature before her brain processed it. Low altitude. Combat approach vector. 2 Black Hawks cutting through the darkness above Sacred Heart like predators circling wounded prey. She didn't move. The helicopters descended over the hospital at 2,100 hours, exactly 5 hours after her termination had been finalized, exactly as if someone had calculated the precise moment of maximum humiliation and then erased it entirely. The lead bird touched down on the roof landing zone, and figures emerged before the rotor wash had fully settled. Navy SEALs. They moved through Sacred Heart with a kind of purpose that made doors open and people step back, not because anyone had told them to, but because the air itself seemed to recognize authority. Their uniforms were wet, field-ready, the kind of tactical wear that came directly from operational theaters. Their leader was a captain. Hannah could see the insignia even at a distance, and he strode through the emergency department like a man who'd been briefed by secure satellite uplink. "We're looking for Major Clarke," he said. Not a question. A demand. Callsign Sandstorm. Combat medic. "We have confirmation she's in this facility." The night shift nurse at the triage desk looked up from her computer. Her name was Jasmine, and she'd worked nights with Hannah for 3 years without asking questions. I'm not sure who that." In the ICU, in a private room with an armed guard standing outside, because of course there was an armed guard now, Chen was awake. The young sergeant's eyes went wide when the Navy captain entered his room. Chen's hands moved immediately, frantically, signing so fast his movements blurred. His cochlear implant flickered with processing light, but he wasn't using it. He was using his hands, using the language that transcended hearing and disbelief. Major. The sign for military rank, modified. Major. Major. Then, she saved my life. The captain turned to the nurse who'd followed him in, and his voice cut through the ICU ambience like a scalpel through flesh. "Get me that file. Military records. Everything we have on this patient's original intake, his service jacket, everything." The night shift nurse, not Jasmine, a different nurse, a young man named David who'd only transferred to night shift 2 weeks ago, he moved toward the records room with the kind of trembling that comes from recognizing power structures clicking into place above you. 10 minutes later, he was standing in the ICU hallway, holding a folder with a red security stripe across it, and his voice shook as he read aloud. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. "Bronze Star," he said. His voice cracked. "Awarded for valor in combat. Purple Heart. Awarded for wounds sustained in action. Second Purple Heart. A third decoration, it says here that portions of this file are sealed by Department of Defense classification level, but it lists 17 combat tours in theater. 17 tours. The captain didn't move. His men didn't move. David kept reading because once you started, your voice couldn't stop you. It says here that Major Clarke was a Special Forces combat medic. The highest commendation, 2 silver stars. Awarded for actions during the siege of Tikrit Field Hospital in 2009. Saving 43 civilians. Under fire. The file says, his voice dropped to a whisper. It says Major Clarke is the most decorated combat medic in Special Forces history. The words hung in the ICU like a scream, and then a Navy voice cut through them. "We're reactivating Major Clarke," the Pentagon liaison said. She was a commander, grey hair pulled back tight, eyes the color of competence. Effective immediately. We need her for a classified training mission at Fort Bragg. Furthermore, we're investigating how her sealed military medical records appeared on civilian insurance broker networks. She turned to the hospital security officer. That's a federal offense. Your IT department is going to cooperate fully with NCIS. Torres was in the server room when they found him. Hospital IT veteran, Marine Corps discharged 3 years prior, the guy who'd fixed Hannah's computer when it crashed last month and never mentioned that he recognized the combat trauma in the way she held her shoulders. He had the security footage queued up before anyone asked for it. The video played in the administrative conference room at midnight, with Dr. Caldwell's lawyer already on his way. Frame 1, Dr. Caldwell at a terminal at 0300 hours, his face illuminated by the glow of a VA database portal. Hands moving with practiced efficiency. Copy. Paste. Fingers tapping through credential access that should never have been available to a mid-level physician. A flash drive emerging from his pocket. Frame 2, the timestamp at 05 for 7 hours. Caldwell in the parking garage, handing a manila envelope to a man in civilian clothes. The man's face was visible for exactly 3 seconds. Insurance investigator. Federal records indicated he'd been prosecuted twice for benefits fraud. The NCIS agent paused the video. Caldwell's lawyer was already on his phone to someone with more authority. "You knew who she was," the agent said. "Not a question. You recognized Major Clarke the moment she examined that patient's jacket. You'd served with her at Tikrit. She could place you at that field hospital. She could testify to your discharge for medication theft from supply convoys." Caldwell's voice was thin, practiced, the sound of a man who'd prepared for this conversation in the shower for months. "Those records weren't properly sealed. That's a VA filing error, not my." The agent opened a new folder. Video 3, Caldwell in the hallway, calling the nursing board at 0800 hours. Video 4, Caldwell reassigning Hannah away from Chen's care. Video 5, Caldwell reviewing the ICU charts at 2050 hours and clearly noting, that the patient's O2 saturation was critically low, that his lung sounds were asymmetrical, that a tension pneumothorax was clinically probable. And then Caldwell walking away. "Patient endangerment," the NCIS agent said. "You missed a diagnosis you clinically observed." By 0200 hours, Caldwell's medical license was under emergency suspension. By 0600 hours, a surgical review board had examined Hannah's field thoracotomy performed with a scalpel through the chest wall to access the pericardium, and they documented their findings with the kind of precision that makes careers end or begin. The only intervention that could have saved the patient's life, the surgical report stated. Combat medical protocols. Extraordinary skill. Caldwell took the plea deal at noon. Complete surrender of his medical license. Repayment of $340,000 in illicit insurance fees. 5 years federal probation. The state medical board didn't even require a hearing, the evidence was that thorough. His name would be removed from every hospital roster in Virginia by end of business. His medical diploma was already gathering dust in a drawer somewhere. Hannah sat in a hotel room 8 blocks from Sacred Heart and stared at the wall. Margaret from HR had arrived at 0800 with formal apologies and reinstatement offers and back pay calculations. Hannah had listened politely and said one word, no. The woman had left confused, holding her folder of papers like it had suddenly become toxic. At 1000 hours, the Pentagon liaison appeared with dress blues and new insignia and orders written on letterhead so classified it barely had a date. Fort Bragg. Special Forces Medic Training. Reactivation effective immediately. Chen had requested assignment to her training unit as a combat interpreter, using his new cochlear implant and his old hands, teaching soldiers how to communicate with deaf patients in the field. The new Major's oak leaves caught the light when Hannah held them up. Polished. Regulation. Real. 3 weeks later, she stood on a military airfield at Fort Bragg wearing a uniform for the first time in 6 years. The morning was cool, the kind of North Carolina temperature that made the pines smell sharp and alive. Chen waited beside her in Army combat uniform, his cochlear implant visible behind his ear, signing a conversation with another soldier, rapid, fluid, the language of people who'd already fought together and lived. The transport plane idled behind them, four-bladed rotors creating a horizon line of heat shimmer. The SEAL captain from Sacred Heart approached one final time, carrying a printout. Caldwell update, he said. Took a position at a strip mall on the outskirts of Norfolk. Folding table. Life insurance sales. Company website doesn't even list him by name, he's just agent available for consultation. Hannah nodded once. The response of a woman who'd already moved past it. Chen signed something, and Torres, now working at a VA hospital IT station, still Marine through and through, translated from 5 feet away where he stood with military precision. He wants to know why you never told anyone. Hannah looked at the young man whose face she still remembered streaked with blood and dust, 6 years old, screaming in Pashto while she held pressure on his leg wound during a firefight. She'd found him in the rubble and brought him out while rounds snapped past her shoulders, and she'd never expected to see him again. I left that life behind, Hannah said. Or I thought I did. The Pentagon liaison brought one final visitor, the CEO of Sacred Heart, who'd driven 2 hours to deliver a formal apology and standing offer of clinical consulting and veteran care program development. Hannah listened politely, her voice level and professional and entirely without mercy. I spent 6 years being invisible, she said. I'm done being quiet. The transport plane engine spun up to full power, and Chen shouldered his pack and signed, thank you. Hannah signed back, 3 years of night shift ASL classes finally clicking into muscle memory, for what? Chen smiled and signed, saving me twice. As the plane lifted off, climbing through North Carolina sunrise with wings that caught fire from the east, Hannah's phone buzzed with a text from a former ISF medic she'd trained 15 years ago, a man whose name she wouldn't remember until he walked into her classroom next week. Heard you're teaching now. Welcome home, Sandstorm. In the distance, across 300 miles of pines and highway, Caldwell sat at his folding table beneath a sun-bleached banner, watching families walk past without stopping, his medical diploma in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust. The hospital had already forgotten his name. What would you do if you discovered you'd been standing next to a legend the whole time? Subscribe and let me know in the comments, plus tell me whether Caldwell's punishment fit his crime.